But anyway, the title of my talk is Ecotopia and air conditioning. Sorry, I didn't realize that the slide actually moved before I even talk. Okay, so I've changed the title a little bit, partly because I've dropped jargon. Thermomodernity essentially means air conditioning, so I'll keep it simple. So let me start with a definition of keywords. The main keyword here is ecotopia, and ecotopia is really a merging of two words, eco and utopia. Of course, when we think about utopia, some people would say that utopia represents something that is unrealistic, something that is unrealizable, and instead of leading to a better future, to betterment, it might actually sometimes lead to the other opposite, which is dystopia. But I would like to imagine, and I like to think that sometimes utopia can be incredibly useful because it represents a kind of a constructive critique of the present. So utopia is as much as about the present moment as it is about the future. And also, I like to imagine that utopia is important because it represents a future for, especially for ecotopia, for a greener and for a better future. Ecotopia is not a word that came out on my own. I actually borrowed the word from a very well-known novel published in the early 1970s, a novel by Ernst Callenbach, who passed away a few years ago, and he used to reside in Berkeley, Northern California. His vision, in the novel, he was portraying a state that in Pacific northeast of the US that seceded from US and started practicing what is now called sustainable economy. So he envisioned a state that practiced things like uses renewable energy, believe in compact urbanism, practices recycling, reuse, things that were fairly radical, things that were rather marginal in the 1970s, things that were literally only practiced by the hippies at the time or before in the 1960s. But then these ideas became very influential. They became so influential that one of the New York Times article, in fact, suggests that Ecotopia, in a way, predicts some of the green cities that you see around us today in US and in Europe. You know, ideas about eating local, for example, ideas about being very compact and also using mass transit. So what were very radical in the 70s became subsequently the norm. And I would like to imagine that Ecotopia is not something that is foreign to Singapore. I think Singapore once, at a particular moment in time, has its own version of Ecotopia as well. And I'm referring to an image from the Master Plan for Kampong Bugis by Mr. Tay King Soon. And I was actually teaching sustainability at NUS, and for my course, I asked my students to envision their version of Ecotopia Singapore. And on the screen are two covers from my students' assignment. This is really an assignment to ask the student to imagine an alternative to what is called the state vision. What is the state vision? The state vision of a livable 6.9 million Singapore. I won't go into the details of what the students did and what they proposed because time doesn't permit me to do that. What I'll do instead is to share with you my minor or my mini ecotopia for Singapore that is based on the research project that I'm doing. I'm working on air conditioning in Singapore, especially on imagining alternatives to air conditioning for a low-carbon future. So as many of you know, Singapore is also called an air-conditioned nation, and the term itself came from Children George. Children George was using the term more as a metaphor to describe the politics of comfort and control in Singapore. And of course, Singapore's reputation as an air-conditioned nation is, in a way, made better known, made more famous, if you like, by the first Prime Minister of Singapore, Mr. Lee, stating that air conditioning is one of the most important inventions of the 20th century. But I would say that air-conditioned nation for Singapore is not just a metaphor, it's more than a metaphor. If you look at, for example, this vision of Singapore, of the most representative symbol of Singapore as a global city, a kind of a rendering produced by URA, you notice that almost every single building here is an air-conditioned building, including the building that is in the garden, the greenhouses in the garden. So it is, in a way, a kind of paradigmatic air-conditioned city. And social scientists and urban studies scholars are also taking that pretty seriously. And if you read newspaper reports in the past few years, for example, you'll notice that indeed, it's not just a metaphor. We are living in spaces that are maybe overly cold, and the representation, for example, of an office that is almost freezing cold with ice, covering the windows. So one question that I have when I started the project is, how did we arrive at this stage? How did we arrive at becoming an air-conditioned nation with spaces that are too cold? And so I did a quick architecture history review of which were the first buildings to be air-conditioned, and subsequently, how did it become more and more prevalent, and how it sort of spread to different kind of buildings. So at the beginning, when we look at air conditioning, it was really a technology of novelty, introduced in the 1930s, first implemented in two cinema, the new Alhambra cinema and the Cathay cinema in 1938 and 1939 respectively. They were advertised and promoted as something to attract moviegoers. You come into a cool space, you enjoy this cool space, and you pay for it. And in the post-war era, we begin to see fully air-conditioned buildings. Two of the well-known ones, the first air-conditioned building in Singapore and in Southeast Asia was the McDonald House. And then in 1955, you have Asian Insurance Building, which is shown on the screen. These buildings then were exceptions. They were really not the typical buildings that were constructed at that time. And because they were exceptions, they require a lot of investment in a technology that was relatively new. They were regarded as prestige project, prestige project that speaks of a confidence in Singapore's future at a time whereby there were a lot of uncertainty, partly because of decolonization. But then air conditioning is never just about novelty and not just about something that is associated with prestige. If you look at colonial ideas or discourse about air conditioning, you'll notice that it is related to this whole notion of health, energy, and civilization. So on the left of the screen is a map that was drawn up by Professor Kenneth Bragg from the King Edward VII Medical School. I think you cannot really see the legend, but essentially you see the world divided into different patches of grayness, from the fully darkened area in east coast of United States and West Europe to areas that has got very little shades, light shades of gray, places in the tropics. And the map is essentially a mapping of the distribution of human health and energy, and is also associated and is in fact drawn from Ellsworth Huntington map of the same title. Essentially a kind of a climatic determinist attempt to map relationship between the kind of climate and the level of civilizational achievement and the level of health of this nation. So you can tell if you are in the temperate climate, in a certain zone of a temperate climate, for example, in Western Europe and in East Coast of the United States, then you are really high energy level and a high state of civilization. Whereas if you're in Singapore, you're in an area whereby you are at the lighter shade of gray, as in many parts of Africa, low attainment in terms of energy and low civilization. And that kind of idea was seized upon by air conditioning company like Carrier in the image on the right to talk about why climate control is very important. So the headline for that advertisement on the right-hand side says, temperature 102 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 30 odd degrees Celsius, production 0. So productivity is very much related, in this case, to climate. And that idea seems to be fairly influential. So this is a quote taken from an interview that Mr. Lee gave in 1990s. He said that air conditioning was the most important invention for us because it changed the nature of civilization by making development possible in the tropics. And also, Which is why the first thing he did after he became the prime minister was to install air conditioning in buildings where the civil service worked. And for him, that is the key to public efficiency and also to his modernization and development program. And the image on the right is one that was produced by the urban planning agency at that time, the predecessor of URA, that was part of HDB. I think it's called the Urban Planning Department. It was just a department then. A vision of what the new downtown should look like. So the new downtown essentially takes on the form of a podium tower typology, fairly uniform podium at the base. And then you have all these towers sitting on top of the podium. But what is interesting is how this geometric vision of the new downtown contrasts with this part of the downtown, the so-called slums that are rendered in fuzzy outlines, that are like shapes like almost like bacteria or algae that has sort of inhabited the city at that time. So urban renewal program at that time, proposed a building type that is very difficult to naturally ventilate because a podium tower typology typically sits on a plot of land that is so big that there is no way to cross-ventilate. So the only way to cool or to create sufficient thermal comfort in a podium tower typology is air conditioning. So implicitly in the vision for urban renewal, in stipulating the type of a podium tower type, it means that you need to have air conditioning. So I'm going to talk about I'm going to briefly talk about this building next, and this is a building that was undergoing construction. At that time, it was the Ministry of National Development building along Maxwell Road. It is still around today, next to today's URA building. So at that time, it was completed in 1969, and the architect has got a pretty interesting description of the building. It says that this is a fully air-conditioned building. It consolidates all the departments of the Ministry of National Development under one single building, so it promotes a certain level of efficiency. And then it went on to talk about its aesthetic. The architects went on to talk about the aesthetic. It said that it has a clean facade, as well as an equally clean and shiny interior. The description was interesting because it never really mentioned the kind of assumed opposite. The assumed opposite is really that, the slums, the dirty streets, the dark and dingy interior of the slums. So the vision of an air-conditioned interior, artificially illuminated by fluorescent lighting, is really imagined as a kind of a modern vision in contrast to certain notions of tradition as represented by the slums and the shophouse. And that manifested as a kind of an exemplary building, almost telling the other developers how to build, by the ministry that is very much in charge of urban renewal. And subsequently, as we move into the 70s, into the early and mid-70s, we see that the podium tower typology transformed into something a lot more complex. With the demolition of the shop houses, with the demise of the streets, you get these multi-use complexes. So office towers are more or less single-use, maybe with some shops at the ground level, at the podium level to support it. But subsequently, in the mid-1970s, we move into integrated multi-use complexes, merging residential, commercial, shopping, and very often leisure users within a single building. And that is really happening partly because the urban environment outside is being radically transformed, and a lot of the traditional streets have gone, and what you have and replace this external urban life is really totally internalized kind of urban lives. And as we move into the 80s and the early 90s, we see a kind of a further intensification of the internalized environment. And what we see here is an example of cities. So no longer just complexes, but cities. Raffles City, Suntec City, Marina Square, and the kind of a related large city-scale development on reclaimed land. And subsequently, that developed even more into a kind of a master plan for public transportation and master plan for even how the marina downtown should be like. Seamless transition between different modes of transportation, moving from one place to another place without even getting to the exterior at all. So it seems that based on this historical narrative, there is no escape from aircon dominance. We are trapped That's it. There's of course all kinds of energy implication for that, and facing the challenge of peak oil and climate change, how are we going to deal with air conditioning? Can we continue this energy-intensive lifestyle? I would like to end with a few slides that maybe offer a possible way out of this. And I'm going to look at pockets of what I call thermal resistance or resilience. By looking at not commercial buildings, but looking at ordinary households in public buildings, in public housing, like the two ones that I've shown here. And this is really based on a survey and a kind of interview that we did with about 10 households last month. So what we actually witnessed is that given the choice, if we actually look at a lot of ordinary households, we really don't live in a space that is totally air-conditioned, living under the hegemony of air conditioning and totally being encased by mechanically cool environment. What we actually witness is that as long as the house owner are able to make certain decisions, you realize that there are a lot of hybrid thermal practices. That means we combine air conditioning with mechanical cooling, with improvisation like the use of tower, the use of shades, the use of other ways of modifying our environment. And the other thing is to attend to the kind of a material culture, to understand that it is not all as if it's portrayed like the two images above in certain interior design magazine, whereby you have the plush upholstery and you also live with thick beddings. If you got no aircon, you can't possibly sleep in a bed like this if you got no air conditioning. Layers and layers of blanket and things like that. So what you actually witness is a lot more humble. You see inhabitants laying over their sofas with more comfortable cotton fabric, for example, so that they don't feel it so sticky. And also you see very light kind of beddings used in many houses. And we also put some data loggers. We try to be more scientific about this. We put some data loggers recording temperature and humidity data. And we realized that many inhabitants actually live in a kind of thermal environment whereby the temperature varies between 29 to 30 degrees Celsius, which is very different from the kind of a techno-scientific prescription of thermal comfort that a lab-based test, based on really putting these young white males as experimental subjects within a total enclosed thermal chamber is actually telling us. So for example, the ASHRAE standard, like the air conditioning for this room, will be between 24 to 26 degrees Celsius because that is deemed as the thermal comfort level. So what are the takeaways from this small little research project and observation? I think there are a few things that maybe designers or maybe even inhabitants can be aware of. Firstly is to design with an awareness of social practices, to understand the built environment in relation to practices and routines. The second is to design for a certain level of flexibility and diversity, especially thermal diversity, so that someone can move into different spaces and inhabit different spaces and adjust the kind of thermal environment according to their whatever they are doing. And the last is to think about material culture in a way that is appropriate for our kind of climate. And with that, thank you.